The night my stepbrother took everything I had, he did me the courtesy of explaining it first, the way a man walks an investor through a balance sheet he is proud of. He sat behind the desk that had been my stepfather's, under the framed certificate that had hung on that wall for 30 years, and he told me kindly, patiently, that I had never really belonged in that house, that the numbers had simply caught up with the sentiment, and that if I signed the papers in front of me it would go easier for my mother. His name was Julian Ashcombe, and he was smiling when he said it, and the terrible thing, the thing I have never been able to explain to anyone who did not live it, is that a part of me believed him. That is how it works. The knife does not come from a stranger in an alley. It comes from the person who taught you which fork to use, across a table you thought was yours, in a voice you have trusted your whole life. I signed. God help me, that first time I signed. Let me tell you how a man can be robbed of everything he is, sign the receipt for it himself, and thank the thief on the way out. Because if you think you are too clever for it, you are exactly the kind of person it happens to. My name is Ezra Wren, and for a long time I was nobody's idea of a threat, which turned out to be the most valuable thing I ever owned. My mother married Gerald Ashcombe when I was 11. She had raised me alone until then, in 2 rented rooms above a laundrette, on the wages of a woman who cleaned other people's offices at night, and she had done it without once letting me believe we were poor, which is a kind of accounting genius the world never gives a medal for. When Gerald met her, she was mopping the lobby of a building he owned, and he was the rare sort of rich man who actually looked at the person holding the mop. He married her for that, not for anything you could put in a photograph. Gerald Ashcombe had built the Ashcombe Group out of one cold storage warehouse on the harbor into a conglomerate that moved half the food in the region, warehouses, logistics, property, a bank's worth of quiet holdings. And he had a son from his first marriage, 3 years older than me, golden and easy and beautiful, named Julian. I want to be fair to Julian because if I make him a monster you will file him under things that happen to other people. Julian was not a monster. Julian was charming in a way that felt like weather, something that simply happened to you, warm and total and impossible to argue with. He remembered the names of everyone's children. He could walk into a room of people who resented him and walk out of it beloved. When we were boys he taught me to swim, and he did it patiently, and he did not have to. I loved him. I need you to understand that I loved him, or none of the rest of it will make sense. Let me give you one small memory because it is the whole of him in miniature, and because I did not understand it until it was far too late. I was 12. There was a boy at our school, a scholarship boy, sharper than either of us, who had beaten Julian at something. A debate, a prize, it does not matter. And I watched Julian, over a single term, befriend that boy so completely, so warmly, praise him so publicly and help him so generously, that by the end the boy would have done anything for him. And then, quietly, at the moment it mattered most, Julian let him fall, and was the very first to comfort him when he did, and no one, not the boy, not the teachers, not me, ever once thought to look at the smiling face that had arranged the whole thing. I remember thinking how kind Julian was, to be so sad for his friend. That is the last thing you understand about a man like Julian. You understand his kindness first, and his craft last, and by then you are the boy on the floor and he is the one kneeling beside you, so sorry, so warm, already looking past you at the next one. Gerald saw something in me that Julian resented, though it took me years to understand what. It was not talent, exactly. It was that I could not lie about a number. I would sit in Gerald's study while he went over the accounts, a boy of 14 doing homework in the corner, and I would say, without meaning to, "That supplier's charging you twice for the same pallet." And I would be right, and Gerald would look at me a long moment and say nothing, and Julian in the doorway would smile. Gerald had a saying. He had it carved into a wooden panel above the study door, and it was the first thing you saw when you walked in and the last thing you saw when you left. Said, "Spend on what remains." He meant it as a rule for the business, spend on the warehouses, the trucks, the people who would still be there in 20 years, and never on the shine that photographed well and rotted by spring. But he meant it as a rule for life too, and I did not understand that until much later, until I had lost everything the shine was made of and found out what remained. Gerald died when I was 26. His heart, in the night, in a chair in that study under the carved panel. And within a week I understood that the man had been the only wall between me and the weather had been waiting a very long time. The will was clean and it was generous and it was, I would learn, already dead on the day it was read. Gerald had left the company to be run jointly, Julian and I as partners, with a controlling trust that protected my mother's stake in mine, a structure so careful it could only have been built by a man who saw exactly what his son was. Gerald had tried to protect us from the grave. He had built a wall of paper around the two people he knew Julian would come for. It was, I think now, the most loving thing anyone ever did for me, and it was not enough, and that is not a criticism of Gerald. Paper is only ever as strong as the people who agree to honor it, and Julian had never in his life agreed to honor anything that did not flatter him. Julian took 11 months to get around it. He did it the way water gets around a wall, which is to say patiently, from below at the speed of trust. I did not see it because I was not looking, and I was not looking because I was grieving, and Julian understood grief the way a hunter understands weather. He was so kind to me those months. He handled everything. He took the meetings I could not face, signed the papers I did not read, protected me, he said, from the ugliness of it, so that I could sit with my mother, who had begun that winter to fail. Let me tell you about my mother's illness, because it is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and because I have never forgiven myself for the part of it I could have seen. She had a condition that was treatable, expensive, ongoing, but treatable, and Gerald had established a trust to pay for it, a specific, funded, protected thing, the kind of provision a man makes when he loves a woman and knows he might die first. It was, on paper, untouchable. Julian touched it. Not with a theft you could photograph. He restructured it, folded it into a holding company he called Blackthorn, presented it to me as tax efficiency across a dinner where he refilled my glass with water and his own concern, and I, who could not lie about a number, did not read the one number that mattered because it was buried in a man I trusted. I have gone over that dinner 10,000 times. I could have seen it. That is the thing I cannot put down. The ledger, the sight, the gift I would later be given. I did not need it for that dinner. I needed only to have doubted him for the length of one page, and I did not, because doubting Julian felt like a betrayal of the only family I had left, and he knew it felt like that, and he set the table accordingly. A man who wants to rob you of a page will always first make reading it feel like an unkindness. The care lapsed for 4 months. For months, while the money that was meant to keep my mother alive sat inside a shell company being used as collateral for Julian's ambitions. She declined in those 4 months in a way she might not have. I will never know for certain. That is the particular cruelty of it. He made sure I would never know for certain so that I could spend the rest of my life doing the arithmetic. And then, before I understood any of it, came the accusation. There was money missing from one of the subsidiaries. A great deal of it moved in a pattern over months through accounts that had my name on them, authorized by signatures that were mine. Because I had signed everything Julian put in front of me in the fog of that winter, protected, he said, from the ugliness. The forgery was not even necessary. I had signed the receipt for my own ruin, exactly as he needed me to, and thanked him for handling things. He did not go to the police. He was far too elegant for that. He came to me in the study under the carved panel, and he explained kindly that it looked very bad, that he had covered what he could, that the board wanted my resignation and my silence and my stake, and that if I fought it the accusation would become public, and my mother, who was by then in a hospital bed the family was, he reminded me, generously paying for, would die knowing her son was a thief. So I signed. I gave him my shares, my seat, my name, and I walked out of the only home I had known since I was 11. And I did not fight, because he had found the one hostage I would never risk. My mother died 6 weeks later. I was with her. She was lucid at the end, and she held my hand, and she said, "You always saw the true number, Ezra. Don't stop." I did not know then that it was the most valuable inheritance anyone had ever left me. I thought it was just a mother loving her son at the end. I had the funeral costs and nothing else. Julian paid for the funeral. He gave a beautiful eulogy. People wept. He found me afterward by the cars, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said he hoped that in time we could be brothers again. And I looked at the warmest, most beloved man I had ever known, and I understood, finally, completely what he was, and I understood that no one would ever believe me, and I said nothing because there was nothing yet to say. I want to tell you I had a plan. I did not. I had a suit that no longer fit a life, a name that now meant thief in every room that mattered, and $1,100. I spent that winter in a way I am not going to dress up for you. There was a stretch of about 3 weeks in the coldest part of it when I slept under the Kestrel Street overpass because the shelters filled early and I had learned, Too late, that pride is the last thing to freeze. I met a man under that overpass I have never forgotten, an older man who had been, in some earlier life, an engineer, and who had lost it all the ordinary way, slowly and then all at once. He shared what he had, which was almost nothing, and one night he said a thing to me that I have carried since. He said, "The world doesn't fall on you all at once, son. It falls on you in the exact order of the corners you cut." I did not understand it then. I understood it later, watching Julian's empire come apart in the precise reverse order of everything Gerald had built and Julian had gutted. The world falls in the order of the corners you cut. Julian had cut every corner Gerald ever refused to. He simply had not felt the bill yet. It was there, at the very bottom, that the thing I have never been able to explain to a single living soul happened to me. I have gone back and forth in the years since on whether to tell this part at all, because it is the part that makes people decide I am lying or unwell. But I promised myself when I started this that I would tell it true, so here it is, and you can do with it what you like. On the third week under the overpass, running a fever, half dreaming, I was watching the traffic, the trucks, mostly the long-haul refrigerated trucks coming off the harbor road, the same trucks I had grown up around, and I found myself doing the old thing, the useless thing, reading them. That one's running heavy and cheap. The operator's cutting maintenance to survive the quarter. That fleet's repainted but the axles are old. Someone dressed it up to sell it. I had always been able to see it, the true condition under the paint, the real number under the claim. My mother's inheritance. Gerald's gift. The thing Julian had resented since I was 14. And then, that night, it was as if something turned the volume up. I will not pretend to understand it. I have stopped trying. But from that night, I could see more, and I could see it as clearly as you see color. Not the future, I want to be precise, because this is where people decide I am claiming to be a wizard, and I am not. I could not see the future. I could see the present, truly, the way an auditor sees it after 6 months of work, except instantly and about anything. The real balance sheet under the pretty one. The lie inside the confident claim. The exact place where a business was rotting under its paint, and the exact number it would take to push it over, and the exact number it would take to save it. I called it the ledger. Not out loud. I had no one to say it out loud to. But that is what it was, as if the world had a second set of books, the true set, the ones kept behind the ones everyone showed each other, and I had been handed the key. My mother spent her life keeping a true set of books in her head, so that a boy would never know he was poor. I think, if there is any sense to be made of it, that I inherited the habit, and the world, for reasons I will never know, decided at the lowest moment of my life to make the habit into sight. And here is the thing I understood, lying under that overpass, that changed everything. That is the actual subject of this whole story, and it is not the ledger. I understood that I could go and destroy Julian tomorrow. I could see it. With what I now had, I could find the rot in Blackthorn Holdings in an afternoon, take it to a journalist, and burn him down inside a month. The forgery, the trust, the missing care fund, all of it. I could have my revenge before spring. And it would not work. That is what I understood, freezing at the bottom of my life. Because I had already tried the truth once in that study, and the truth had lost because Julian was more believable than I was and always would be. A ruined man crying fraud about his beloved brother is not evidence. It is a symptom. The room does not weigh the claim. It weighs the man, and Julian would win that weighing every single time in every room for the rest of our lives. The truth does not defend itself. I had learned that in a study under a carved panel at the cost of a mother. If I wanted Julian to fall, I could not tell the world what he was. I had to build a machine that made him show them himself, and then I had to make sure that when he showed them, there was an independent hand on the record, someone with no reason to love me and no reason to lie, who would simply confirm dryly that the numbers were the numbers. So I did not go to a journalist. I got up and I got a job, and I began very quietly to keep the second set of books. Let me tell you how you rebuild a life from $1,100 and a thing you cannot explain, because the how is the whole point, and it is less magical than you would think and more patient than you would like. The ledger did not make me rich. It made me right, which is a different thing, and slower. Being right about a market only pays if you can act on it, and acting takes capital, and I had none. So the first year I did the only thing I could. I found other people's money that was about to be wrong, and I was right for them for a fee quietly under a name that was not mine. The very first time, I had $40 and a library card. There was a mid-sized haulage company whose stock the whole market had decided was safe, and I could see, plainly the way you see that a bridge is about to go, that its largest depot was mortgaged twice and its insurance was a fiction, that it was 3 months from a collapse no one else had priced. I could not short it. I had $40. So I wrote it up, cleanly, without a single adjective, just the true numbers set beside the claimed ones, and I sent it and signed to a small fund I knew held the stock. I asked for nothing. I only wanted to know if the site was real, or if the overpass had simply broken my mind. 11 weeks later the company collapsed exactly as I had written, to the week and the fund's manager. A careful, unshowy man named Halloran. Spent a month trying to find out who had sent him the note that saved him, and when he finally did, he did not care that I was a disgraced man named Ezra Wren. He cared that I had been right when he had been about to be very wrong. Careful men always care about that, in the end, more than they care about a reputation. That is a thing the Julians of the world never understand, and it is the crack I would eventually pour a whole life through. I called the name I traded under Gray Harbor Capital. It was me, a rented desk, and a habit of never being in the photograph. I would find a small fund drowning in a position it did not understand, and I would show its manager, without ever showing my method, exactly what was rotting under the paint, and I would be right so consistently that within 18 months I did not have to look for the money anymore. The money looked for Gray Harbor, and every dollar of it, I kept off the books that could be traced to a disgraced man named Ezra Wren, because the whole architecture depended on Julian never once suspecting that the quiet capital gathering at the edges of his world was the brother he had thrown under an overpass. I need you to understand the discipline of those years, because it is the opposite of what a revenge story is supposed to be. Every instinct in me wanted to move. There were nights, many of them, when I had, sitting in front of me, enough to hurt him, not to end him, just to hurt him, to make him feel one cold finger of what was coming. And God, I wanted to. I would draft the anonymous letter to a regulator, the quiet word to a journalist, and I would get as far as the sending, and then I would hear the study and the water in the glass, and I would delete it because I had learned the most expensive lesson of my life the first time. A wound that does not kill only teaches the animal where you are. To hurt Julian early was to warn him. And a warned Julian was a Julian who would simply become weather somewhere else, and start again, warm and beloved and untouchable, and I would have spent my one shot on the satisfaction of a bruise. So I did nothing. For 3 years I did nothing to him. I only watched and I only recorded and I only grew. And I watched him do, from a distance, exactly what men like Julian do when they are handed something a better man built. He spent on the shine. He mortgaged the estate, quietly, to fund a run of glamorous acquisitions. A media company, a football stake, a tower with his name on the glass. He gutted the boring, profitable core of the Ashcombe Group, the warehouses, the cold chain, the unglamorous arteries Gerald had spent a lifetime on, and he poured the money into things that photographed well and rotted by spring. He was doing the exact opposite of the carved panel. He was spending on what would not remain. And every quarter, in the reports I read the way other men read scripture, the shine grew and the arteries narrowed, and I could see, with total clarity, a man building his own gallows plank by plank, and I understood that my only real job was to own the wood. There came a moment in the second year when it nearly came apart, and I want to tell you about it, because a story that is all patience and cleverness is a lie, and I promised you the truth. Gray Harbor had grown large enough, by then, to appear on the edge of the wrong radar. Julian, flush and expanding, went looking to raise money for one of his shining acquisitions, and his people, not Julian himself, he would never trouble himself with the actual numbers. His people ran the usual checks on the quiet pools of capital in the region, and one of them, a diligent young analyst doing her job properly, put together a short list of anonymous funds that had been suspiciously right, suspiciously often, about companies in Ashcombe's orbit. Gray Harbor was on that list. She wrote a memo. She flagged it. She recommended someone find out who was behind Gray Harbor Capital, because whoever it was seemed to know things they should not. I knew about the memo the day after it was written, because by then I had done to Julian's world exactly what he had done to mine. I had made myself, quietly, the person who saw the papers, and I sat with that memo for a long night, and I felt the whole edifice sway, and every instinct I had screamed to pull back, to go dark, to protect myself. And I understood that pulling back was the losing move, the same way fighting had been the losing move in the study. If Gray Harbor suddenly went quiet and cautious, it would look like exactly what it was, a hunter that had noticed it was seen. So I did the opposite. I made Gray Harbor, for 6 months, boring. I had it make a run of dull, public, unremarkable investments, the kind of thing a merely lucky fund does, and I made sure the one person who might have pursued the memo, the diligent young analyst, was quietly headhunted by a firm with no connection to me into a better job she richly deserved and could not refuse. I did not silence her. I did not threaten her. I simply removed the only curious mind in Julian's building by giving it something more interesting to be curious about, and Julian, who never read the memos anyway, let the thread drop because the fund had gone boring, and boring is invisible. It cost me a great deal to arrange, and it was the best money I ever spent, because it bought the one thing the whole plan required and could never replace: his continued certainty that I had died under an overpass. That was the year I learned that the hardest part of patience is not the waiting. It is the moment the waiting is threatened, and every nerve tells you to abandon it, and you have to do the calm thing instead of the safe thing, because they are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the whole of victory. And while I did all of that, I found the two people who would turn a machine into a case. The first was a woman named Nadia Cole. She had been the Ashcombe Group's head of internal audit, which is to say she had been the person whose entire job was to see the true number, until the winter Julian needed no one seeing true numbers, and he had let her go with a generous package and a quiet warning. I found her running the accounts of a small haulage firm for a third of what she was worth, and I did not tell her who I was, not at first. I told her Gray Harbor needed a forensic accountant who was not afraid of powerful men. I remember the interview because she saw through the half of it that mattered. She looked at me across the table. She had a way of looking at you that felt like being audited, and she said, "You know who I used to work for?" Not a question. I said I did. She said, "Then you know what happened to the last person who wouldn't stop looking at their books?" And I said, "Yes. She's sitting across from me, worth 3 times what she's being paid, keeping a firm honest that will never deserve her." Something moved in her face then. She had 4 years of records, it turned out, dated, factual, untouched by adjectives, kept in a box she had never quite been able to burn, because a woman who cannot lie about a number cannot bring herself to destroy the true one, even when it costs her to keep it. She had known, without knowing why, that one day someone would need what she had written down. Julian had made the same mistake with her that he had made with me. He had discarded a person who could not lie about a number, and left her alive and angry, and keeping her own quiet books. The second was a man named Thomas Reed. He had been Gerald's operations foreman for 30 years, the man who actually knew where every truck and every compressor and every honest employee in the whole empire was, and Julian had pushed him out early because men like Thomas Reed remember what the shine costs and say so out loud. I found him fixing boat engines on the harbor, and when I finally told him who I was, and Thomas was the first person I told, because Thomas had carried me on his shoulders when I was 11 and had wept at Gerald's grave in a way Julian only performed, he looked at me for a long time, wiping his hands on a rag, and he said, "I always wondered when you'd come back. Your mother told me you would." Right before the end, she said, "Ezra sees the true number, Thomas. He'll come back and he'll set the books right." I thought she was just a dying woman hoping, and then this enormous, quiet man put his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder Julian had gripped by the cars, and it did not feel the same at all, and I had to turn away so he would not see my face. I told Thomas everything, that night, on the harbor, even the ledger, the part one have never told another soul, and he did not decide I was unwell. He listened to all of it, and at the end he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Gerald used to say you could smell a lie in a number the way I could hear a bad bearing 3 trucks away. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe the good Lord just turned yours up because you needed it more." I have never had a better explanation, and I have stopped looking for one. With Nadia's records and Thomas's knowledge and the ledger sight, I had, at last, the 2 things I had lacked in that study 3 years before. I had the truth, and I had witnesses to it who owed me nothing and whom no one could dismiss as a bitter, ruined brother. But I still did not move, because a case is not enough. Julian could explain a case. A warm man can explain almost anything, and I had watched him explain worse. I needed the case to arrive at the exact moment his own greed detonated in public, so that the room would not be weighing my word against his, It would be watching his empire fall of its own weight, and merely turning, in the wreckage, to an independent hand to ask why. That independent hand mattered more than anything. This is the part people get wrong about revenge. I did not want to be believed. Being believed is fragile. It depends on people liking you, and no one was ever going to like me more than Julian. I wanted to be irrelevant to the conclusion. I wanted a mechanism so clean that my own credibility never entered the room, where the market itself and a regulator with no stake in either of us did the accusing, and all I had done was decline to catch a falling man. Here is how the machine closed, and I promise you every piece of it was real because a fabricated trap can be explained and a real one cannot. There was a company called Ironvale Cold Storage. It was, in its bones, the best cold chain operator on the harbor, old, unglamorous, superbly run at the level that matters, the trucks and the compressors and the people. It was also, on paper, dying because it had taken on debt at the wrong moment and its largest customer had been quietly poached. That customer had been poached by the Ashcombe Group. Julian was strangling Ironvale deliberately because he had shorted it. He had placed an enormous, leveraged bet that Ironvale would collapse, and then he had used the Ashcombe Group's muscle to help it collapse so that his bet would pay. It was elegant. It was profitable. It was, I could see with total clarity, the single most overextended position in his entire empire, because to make the short big enough to matter to a man of his appetites, he had borrowed against everything, including the mortgage on the estate. Julian had made one bet too large to lose. My whole revenge, in the end, was simply refusing to let him win it. I did not save Ironvale with a grand gesture. I saved it the way Gerald would have, from below, in the boring places. Grey Harbor began buying Ironvale's distressed debt. The loans everyone else was fleeing. At pennies, patiently, from lenders desperate to be rid of them. I bought the supplier claims. I bought the mortgage on Ironvale's own harbor depot. And, through a chain of holding companies no one had the patience to trace, I bought the mortgage on the Ashcombe estate itself. The one Julian had drawn against to fund his short, the one he had stopped thinking about the moment the money cleared. I did not announce myself. To the market, Ironvale was still a dying company with a scattering of new, quiet creditors, and Julian's short looked more certain by the week. He thought he was watching a company drown. He was watching me build a floor under it, one plank at a time, out of the very debt he was counting on to sink it. And I put Thomas Reed inside Ironvale, quietly, as an operations consultant, because the one thing the company needed that money could not buy was the 30 years of knowledge Julian had thrown away onto a harbor to fix boat engines. Under Thomas, the trucks that had been failing stopped failing. The compressors held. The people, who had been treated like a cost to be cut, were treated like the arteries they were. Ironvale did not become glamorous. It became reliable, which in the cold chain is the only thing that has ever mattered, and reliability, unlike shine, cannot be faked and does not rot by spring. I still did not move against Julian. I want you to feel how long this was because the length is the whole point. 3 years under, then 2 more building, then a year with the machine fully assembled and my hand off the lever, watching, waiting for him to lean the last inch out over the drop. There were mornings I hated the patience more than I hated him. But I had learned the price of the fast knife, and I would not pay it twice. Here is how it closed. The Ashcombe Group's short against Ironvale had a specific, knowable pressure point, a date, a threshold, a level of borrowing beyond which the whole bet would flip from genius to catastrophe. Julian could not see it clearly because Julian did not keep a true set of books. He kept the pretty ones, the ones that told him he was winning. I could see it exactly. Ironvale did not need to become a great company overnight to ruin him. It only needed to not die. It needed one piece of genuine, boring good news large enough to make its share price rise instead of fall, at the moment Julian's borrowing was most extended. So I gave it one, and it was the most honest thing I have ever done. There was a public contract coming up for tender, the regional food security and port logistics contract, the boring backbone of moving food through the harbor, exactly the kind of unshiny 20-year artery Gerald had built his life on. The Ashcombe Group assumed it would win it, as it always had, on its name. But its cold chain, the real one, the one Julian had gutted to fund the shine, could no longer actually do the work. Ironvale's could. I did not rig the tender. I want to be very clear because it is the whole moral spine of this. I did not rig it, could not have, would not have. I simply made sure Ironvale survived long enough to bid, and Ironvale won it on the merits, judged by an independent public authority with no idea I existed, because Iron Veil was, in the one way that mattered, better, and I had spent 3 years making sure the one way that mattered was the only way it would be judged. The morning Iron Veil won the port contract, its share price did the one thing Julian's entire leveraged empire could not survive. It rose. And it did not stop rising because every other short seller in the market, seeing the news, scrambled to buy their way out of the same bet Julian had made too large to exit. A short squeeze, the market's own guillotine, requiring no villain and no lie, only arithmetic. Julian's brokers began to call for the money he had borrowed against, and the money was not there because it was buried in shine, and the collateral behind it was the mortgage on the estate whose mortgage, through 18 quiet months and a chain of holding companies no one had bothered to trace, was now held by Gray Harbor Capital. By me. I owned the ground under his empire. I had bought it a foot at a time while he mistook me for a man who had frozen to death under an overpass. He held a memorial gala that season. He held one every year, ostensibly for Gerald, actually for himself. A grand evening under the chandeliers of the estate, the great and the good, the warmest man in every room moving through it like weather. He did not know that night that the walls were mine. I went. I want to be honest about that too. I did not need to be there. The machine did not require my presence, and there was a risk in it. But I had spent 4 years being no one, and I found I could not let the last night of it happen without standing in the room. So I put on the suit that fit a different life now, and I walked back into the only home I had known since I was 11, and no one stopped me at the door because a man who owns the mortgage on a house is, in the one sense that would come to matter, on the guest list. He was mid-collapse and did not fully feel it yet, the way a tree does not feel the last cut. He stood up under the carved panel that still said "Spend on what remains," and he gave a speech about his father's legacy, and about vision, and about the future, and he was luminous, and people wept, and I stood at the back of the room, and for the first time in 4 years my brother's eyes passed over me and did not know me. I had become, at last, exactly what he had made me. No one. I had not come to make a speech. That is the mistake the ruined always want to make, and it is the losing move. I had learned, in a study, that the room does not weigh the accusation. It weighs the man. So I did not accuse him of anything. I let the machine do it. While he spoke, the news was already moving. The margin calls had hit that afternoon. An independent examiner appointed by the exchange's surveillance unit, a person with no love for me and no reason to lie, had, in reviewing the sudden collapse of the Ashcombe Group's positions, followed the collateral as such people must, and found that the mortgage securing a systemically large short position had been drawn against a family trust, and that the family trust had, years earlier, quietly absorbed a smaller protected trust, a care trust, in the name of a woman named Miriam Wren, deceased. The examiner did not know what it meant. The examiner only knew it was irregular, and wrote it down dryly, without adjectives, in a filing that would be public by Monday. And Nadia Cole, that same evening, walked into that examiner's office and set a box on the desk, 4 years of dated, factual records, offered not as an accusation but as cooperation, the discarded auditor simply doing, at last, the job she had been fired for being willing to do. Set against the examiner's own findings, against the market's own arithmetic, against the paper trail of Blackthorn Holdings, the pattern stopped being a bitter brother's story and became a thing no room could unread. A victim says he ruined me and the room weighs the victim. A record says on this date he moved this trust to this shell and pledged it as collateral on that date, and the room does not weigh anyone at all. It simply reads. And what it reads, it cannot unread. I watched Julian understand it. I had thought I would want to watch. I found in the moment that I did not. He was mid-sentence, luminous, beloved, and I saw the exact instant a phone was put into his hand at the edge of the stage, and I saw the weather go out of him. I had waited 4 years to see it, and when it came I felt no triumph. I felt the study and the water in the glass and my mother's hand and the 4 months. I felt the cost of the thing, which no ledger had ever shown me and no victory ever paid back. He found me, later, in the emptying room the way he had found me by the cars 4 years before. He was not luminous anymore. Men like Julian are never quite defeated. They are only, as someone once told me, relocated. But he was smaller the way a fire looks smaller in daylight. You, he said, just that, at first. Then, you did this. No, I said, and I meant it. And it was the cruelest and truest thing I have ever said to anyone. You did this. I just refused to catch you. I bought the ground you were already falling toward, and I waited and I kept the record. That's all revenge ever is, Julian. It isn't a knife. It's a witness who won't look away. He asked me how long. They always ask how long. And I told him the truth in the only language he would ever accept. Since the overpass, I said. You should have made sure. You left me alive and angry and able to read the true number. You didn't just discard me, you discarded Nadia and Thomas, everyone who couldn't lie about a number, because we were inconvenient to a man who lives on the pretty books. You taught 3 people how to survive you, and then you gave us 4 years to practice. Father told you how it ends. It's carved above your head. You spent it all on what wouldn't remain. He looked up at the panel at his father's words, as if seeing them for the first time, and I think for 1 second he understood. Then the second passed because men like Julian cannot afford to understand for longer than that, and he left and I let him. I did not need the room to exist anymore. I had needed only for the truth to be on the record permanent, in a form the warmest smile on earth could not talk its way out of. And it was. I want to tell you that fixing it felt like justice. It did not. Felt like work. The Ashcombe group did not survive Julian in the form he had made it, and I did not try to save that form because that form was the shine. But the core, the warehouses, the cold chain, the trucks, Iron Vale, the 2,000 people whose unglamorous jobs Julian had been feeding to the fire, that I saved because it was what remained, and I had promised a carved panel and a dead man and a woman who died doing arithmetic that I would spend on what remained. Thomas Reed runs the operations now the way he did for Gerald, and does it to build and not to take. Nadia Cole keeps the books, all of them. The true set out in the open where no one ever has to keep a second one in secret again. I made her a partner and I structured it so that no one could ever do to her what was done to me, which is the only kind of monument I have any faith in. It cost more than the winning was worth and I would do it again, and both of those things are true, and I have stopped needing them to reconcile. I spent a year rebuilding relationships Julian had spent a decade charming, and the irony was not lost on me. To save what remained, I had to learn to walk into rooms and be a little warm, a little present, a little like the thing he had been. I was bad at it. I got less bad. I am not sure I like the man who learned it. That is a cost too, and no one warns you about it because it does not photograph. I kept the study. I kept the carved panel. I sit under it now, some nights, going over the accounts, a habit I cannot break and no longer want to. Here is the thing I actually learned, and it is not the thing you think. The ledger, the sight, the gift, the thing I cannot explain, did not save me. I want to be honest about that because it is the part that matters. It let me see the true number, but I had always been able to see the true number. My mother saw it her whole life with nothing but love and arithmetic and never a warehouse to her name. The sight was never the difference between the man under the overpass and the man in the study. The difference was that the second time I kept the record and I waited and I found the 2 other people the world had thrown away for the same crime of honesty that I had committed, and I refused, absolutely refused, to let my hurt make me move before the trap was closed. Julian took everything from me that could be photographed. He could not take the one thing my mother left me, because it was not a thing. It was a habit. See the true number. Write it down. Don't stop. If you have your own Julian, and most people do, eventually, someone warm who is slowly moving into rooms you thought were yours, someone the whole world finds more believable than you. I am not going to tell you to trust more. That would be a lie, and I have paid too much for lies to start telling new ones. I will tell you this instead. Keep the record. Not out of hatred, and not because everyone is a Julian, because they are not. Keep it because the truth does not defend itself, and the warmest liar in the world will always outtalk an honest man who has nothing written down. I learned that in a study under a carved panel at the cost of my mother and 4 years of my life. See the true number. Write it down while it is happening. Spend your life on what remains. You may never need it. I hope you never need it. But if the day ever comes when someone you loved is sitting behind your father's desk, explaining kindly why you never really belonged, the only thing that will still be on your side is the record you kept when you still believed you would never have to use it. Kept mine. That is the whole difference between the first time and the second. Not the gift. Not the sight. The record. It always was.